Hi everyone, how's it going? Today I'm going to talk about some short stories. I have the collection The Angel Esmeralda by Don DeLillo. This was published in 2011, and it is 9 short stories that DeLillo has published over the years in various outlets. And they're in chronological order, so you can kind of see a little bit of the evolution of DeLillo as a writer. So the book is divided up into 3 parts. So I think I'm just going to make this a 3-part series of videos where I just talk about all of the short stories in this collection. So the two I'm going to talk about today in part 1 are creation and human moments in World War III. Okay. So I'll talk about creation first, and this was published in 1979. This story follows a couple who are vacationing in the Caribbean, and they are they want to get a flight out of this island that they're staying at, and they just can't. Every day they're trying to get a flight, and they just keep getting refused or put on standby, and they are kind of stuck on this island in this unfamiliar place that's messing up their plans. And as they're waiting, they are getting more and more anxious, especially the wife who has to get back home for work, and she's really getting upset about the wait. Jill is the name of the wife. The husband's the narrator, I believe, who I don't believe is named in the story. I don't believe so. But anyway, they are going back and forth every day, trying to get a ticket off the island. And one night, Jill just sort of has a bit of a breakdown, says, I have to get out of here. I can't take this anymore. I want to go. The next day when they go to the airport, they find out there is a spot on a plane, but for only one person. And the narrator, her husband, says, well, why don't you just go? And they kind of go back and forth, but eventually she decides to go back by herself. So, and then the story takes a bit of a turn where there's another woman on the island, Krista, who is they sort of know her, but sort of don't. And well, anyway, as soon as Jill leaves, the narrator begins an affair with Krista. All we know that she's a German woman. Not sure why she's there. I believe we learned that she's an artist or a painter, I believe. And they begin a brief affair. And then as we get to the end of the story, and I will be spoiling these, they learn that there's been a plane crash, and possible plane crash. They don't know. It's a rumor. So was Jill on that plane? We don't really know. But the story just sort of ends there, where the narrator and Krista are still stuck on the island, and that's where we're at. So you can read the story and look like, well, not a lot happens here except the big dramatic turn in the story where the narrator begins an affair. And I think the story really gets into themes of identity, the theme of being in an unfamiliar place, and what that does to us psychologically, the feeling of just being stuck and not being, it's almost like when you're outside of your normal day-to-day routines and you're in an unfamiliar place. It's like something with your identity starts to change, and that seems to be what's happening in the story. Like, there's no epiphany moments or anything. It's just as if these characters are in this fairly common situation of being stranded somewhere, and things sort of happen. I thought the story reminded me a lot of the films of Michelangelo Antonioni, who directed films like Blow Up and The Passenger. This short story reminded me a lot of The Passenger, 1975 film, which is about a journalist played by Jack Nicholson, who ends up stealing the identity of a weapons dealer, and just like the story becomes this meditation on how easily identities can shift under different environments and different circumstances. And that's really what this short story is about too. I think just how environment shapes us and changes us, and how the anxiety that comes with that. So it's yeah, it's it's a interesting story to start out with. And then the second story has a more specific or literal title, Human Moments in World War III. This was published in 1983 in Esquire magazine. And this story is about, I guess you could say, two astronauts. Well, they're not really astronauts. I guess they're working for the military. And they are orbiting the Earth. And a war, massive conflict breaks out on Earth as these two men are up there orbiting the Earth. And like I said, they're actually part of the military, and their job is something with laser technology they're doing. We don't learn nothing about the specifics of the conflict happening on the Earth. All DeLillo reveals is that nuclear weapons have been banned in this world, so it sort of has given countries a license to go to war easier without the threat of those weapons being used. So it's so there's that aspect of it. So there is kind of this Twilight Zone vibe to the story. Like I said, it's told from the first person, and the narrator is not really at odds, but the other astronaut is much younger than him, and is very smart, very bright, very earnest type of person, young man in his 20s, I guess you could say. And there's kind of this quiet tension between them where the narrator wants to keep all of their interactions just all business, small talk, and the younger astronaut wants to get into these big discussions all the time about philosophy and war and all these big weighty issues. And I think there's a passage I wanted to read that kind of gets to do that. So this is the narrator saying, I try to keep our conversations on an everyday plane. I make it a point to talk about small things, routine things. This makes sense to me. It seems a sound tactic under the circumstances to restrict our talk to familiar topics, minor matters. I want to build a structure of the commonplace, but Vollmer, the name of the other astronaut, has a tendency to bring up enormous subjects. He wants to talk about war, weapons of war. He wants to talk about global strategies, global aggressions. I tell him now that he has stopped describing the Earth as a cosmic eye, and he wants to see it as some game board or computer model. So that kind of gives you a taste of it. And a big theme of the story, too, is how their perspective in all this, where they are orbiting around the Earth. And, of course, you'll hear astronauts say, or anyone who's been to space, that your perspective on everything changes once you've seen the Earth from a distance. And that's definitely what Vollmer's going through. And towards the end of the story, he just becomes more and more obsessed with just staring at the Earth, and he becomes far more quieter and less talkative, and he seems to become more interior and obsessive as the story moves on. But just the perspective of a massive conflict going on the Earth and what that would look like to people orbiting the Earth who are removed from it all. It almost like gives them like this almost like godlike perspective on everything. They talk about how the Earth is beautiful on one hand, but they also see so much danger everywhere from natural disasters, and you get a sense of how violent and unstable the planet can be, but also how peaceful it can be. So the story really moves into this more abstract philosophical mode as it moves along, as they try to grapple with what's happening down there. And I think it may be something with the difference in age. We never do get the age of the narrator, but he just seems all business. Like his attitude is like, we just have a job to do, so let's do it. And the younger man, like I said, he wants to pursue deeper questions and get to the bottom of things. So there's a lot in here. It takes a surreal turn at certain points where they start getting like odd radio signals, and it turns out that they're old like radio shows from like the 30s and 40s. So they're listening to these old radio shows, like almost a ghost of the human past, and just a lot of surreal things like that. And kind of like, it's a very introspective story about where your mind would go in such a um, extreme situation like that with what they're observing or what's happening. So it's like I said, like the first story, it's a very atmospheric piece. There's some philosophy, there's some surrealism, but there's also, I think, a lot of psychology as well happening in the story, which I liked, which made for a fairly compelling story. So those were the first two stories, Creation and Human Moments in World War III. And I'll be back to talk about the middle section of the Angel Esmeralda, probably shortly. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Have a good day.